The winter park lay silent beneath a sky heavy with snow, the kind of quiet that makes a man believe the world is paused just long enough for him to breathe. Mason Cole sat alone on the frost-coated bench, Ranger resting at his feet, both wrapped in the stillness that only a December night can offer. For the first time in months, Mason felt the weight in his chest ease, until the sound of frantic footsteps shattered the calm. From the swirling white haze, a little girl burst into view, her thin dress whipping in the wind, her cheeks streaked with tears as she stumbled toward him. She stopped just a few feet away, trembling, eyes wide with a fear no child should ever know. "Please, please help my mom," she cried, voice breaking. "He's still inside the house." In that single moment, a desperate girl, a frozen knight, and a Marine who had already survived too many storms, Mason understood that whatever peace he hoped to find had just been replaced by a battle he could not walk away from. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, hit subscribe so you never miss another tale of courage, faith, and miracles. A pale winter dusk sagged over Redwood Falls, snow drifting in slow, heavy curtains across the abandoned park. Sergeant Mason Cole sat alone on a frostbitten bench, his gloved hands resting loosely on his knees while his breath curled upward in faint white spirals. 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried the kind of physical presence that came from more than a decade in the United States Marine Corps. His hair, cut military short and black as wet stone, clung to his scalp beneath the falling snow. His face was sharply structured, angular jaw, deep-set dark eyes, and a faint scar brushing across his left cheekbone, an old souvenir from a chaotic deployment in Fallujah. The scar, along with the thread of exhaustion woven permanently into his expression, made him look a man shaped more by survival than by peace. Mason had spent the last half-year dealing with the aftershocks of a mission gone wrong, one that cost 2 men under his command their lives. No matter how many times his commanding officer told him there was nothing he could have done, Mason carried the blame like a weight chained to his ribs. He had taken leave in Redwood Falls only because the quiet, snowy town was the closest thing he had to a childhood memory. He had lived here for one winter when he was 12, before his father, a restless truck driver, picked up the family and moved again. Mason remembered almost nothing except the constant snowstorms, the silence, and his own loneliness. Somehow, that silence comforted him now. It felt honest. Beside him, lying on the snow-dusted ground like a patient sentinel, was Ranger, his 5-year-old German Shepherd K9 partner. Ranger was a large, muscular dog with a thick amber-toned coat that contrasted sharply with the blue-gray winter light. His ears stayed perked at attention, his intelligent brown eyes sweeping the park with practiced vigilance. Ranger had saved Mason's life twice, once from a roadside IED, once from himself on a bad night when memories and guilt grew too loud. The dog was steady, loyal, calm, a grounding force in the storm Mason carried inside. The park was almost entirely empty. Only the skeletal silhouettes of leafless oaks stood outlined against the white dusk. Snow blanketed the pathways, muffling sound and softening every shape. There should have been children playing, or at least someone walking a dog, but the cold was sharp enough to make even the bravest residents stay home. Mason didn't blame them. The wind bit through layers, curled under collars, whispered through branches like a quiet warning. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a long breath that stung his nose with icy burn. For a moment, just one moment, he let himself pretend the world was peaceful. Then Ranger's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest, a sound too deep to ignore, the kind that vibrated against the air like a tension string pulled tight. Mason's eyes opened immediately, instincts firing like well-worn machinery. Ranger never growled without reason. "Easy," Mason murmured, though his pulse had already begun to climb. "What do you see?" Ranger raised himself onto his paws, muscles coiling with alertness as his gaze fixed on something across the snowy park path. Mason followed the look and saw movement. At first it seemed like a flicker, a smear of color against the white haze. Then it materialized into the small, stumbling form of a child, a little girl, barefoot, running, her thin pink dress torn and soaked with snow. Her hair, light brown with a messy curl, clung damp against her pale cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Each step she took sank into the snow, faltering, desperate. Mason rose from the bench instantly. "Ranger, stay close." The child made it only a few more feet before she collapsed forward, catching herself on her trembling hands. Mason sprinted toward her, boots crunching through ice. Snow whipped around them, and the sharp wind carried the sound of her ragged breathing. When he reached her, he knelt and gently lifted the girl onto her knees. Her skin felt icy cold. Her small fingers were swollen with bruises, and faint purplish marks climbed up her forearms, marks that were unmistakably shaped like someone's grip. Mason's stomach tightened. The girl looked up at him with wide hazel eyes, wet, frightened, shining with tears that froze at the edges. Her voice came out in a choked whisper, barely audible over the wind. "Please, help my mommy." Mason leaned in. Hey, slow down, you're safe. I'm right here. Tell me what happened." His tone was gentle but steady, the calm voice of someone who'd talked people through panic many times before. The little girl swallowed hard, her teeth chattering so violently Mason felt the tremor through his gloves. "He hurt her," she sobbed. "He hurt my mommy and he's still inside the house." Mason felt the shift inside him, the instant, absolute click of mission mode. Ranger inched closer, sniffing the child, then releasing another low growl as if confirming her fear. "What's your name?" Mason asked softly. Emily Parker," she managed. "Okay, Emily, I'm Mason. This is Ranger. We're going to help you, but I need you to tell me who's inside the house." Emily's tiny shoulders shook harder. Derek Vaughn, Mommy's boyfriend. He was yelling. He wanted something. She wouldn't give it to him, and then..." She broke into a sob, burying her face against Mason's coat. Mason wrapped an arm around her gently, shielding her from the wind. "You did the right thing coming for help." Inside, though, something hot surged up in him. Anger, protective instinct, and a spark of something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Ranger suddenly barked once, sharp, focused. Mason looked up. There was no one else. In the park, but Ranger's ears were angled toward the direction Emily had come from. He wasn't reacting to movement. He was reacting to scent. Fear. Maybe blood. Mason shifted Emily securely in his arms. "Emily," he said, voice steady despite the storm inside him, "is your mother hurt badly?" Emily nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "She wasn't moving when I left." Mason exhaled, the cold air billowing around him like smoke. That was all he needed to hear. He stood, lifting Emily easily. She clung to him, her small fingers knotting into his coat. Ranger paced beside them, tail stiff, ready. "Ranger," Mason commanded quietly. "Track." The dog lowered his nose, sniffed the air, then locked onto a direction. Mason started toward it, his boots crunching through snow. The wind pressed against his back, pushing them forward as if urging them not to waste another second. Emily pressed her face against Mason's shoulder, her voice small and trembling. "Will he hurt her again?" Mason tightened his grip on her. "Not if I get there first." The storm grew heavier, the sky darkening to iron. Ranger moved faster, pulling slightly ahead, his growl deepening with each step. Emily shivered violently, whispering something almost too soft to hear. "Mr. Mason, I think he had a knife." Mason's breath hitched, his heart pounded with a cold, focused fury. "Ranger, faster!" The dog lunged forward, guiding them through the swirling wall of snow toward a neighborhood at the edge of the park, toward a house where a woman might already be dying. And just as Mason reached the street, Ranger stopped abruptly, hackles raised, staring at a lone figure standing half-hidden at the corner of the block. Someone was watching them, and whoever it was, wasn't moving. Snow hammered the streets in violent, swirling sheets as Mason Cole pushed forward with Emily Parker clutched tightly against his chest. The storm made it nearly impossible to see anything more than a few feet ahead, but Ranger cut through the whiteout like he was born for it. The German Shepherd moved with fierce purpose, his nose low, his body slicing through the drifts as if every snowflake only sharpened his resolve. Mason's breath came out in hard bursts, each inhale burned like ice in his lungs, each exhale disappearing into the roar of the blizzard. He adjusted his hold on Emily, feeling how cold her small body had become. Her cheek was pressed into his shoulder, and he could feel her shivering through his coat. "You're doing great," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him over the wind. "Just a little longer." Emily's fingers clung desperately to his jacket. When she finally spoke, her voice was so faint it nearly dissolved into the storm. "Is Mommy gonna be okay?" Mason forced his steps to stay steady. "I won't let anything happen to her." It wasn't a promise made recklessly. It was instinct, duty, and an echo of something inside him that had been asleep for far too long. Ranger suddenly barked, the sound sharp enough to cut through the storm. He darted right toward a row of houses half buried under snow. Mason followed, boots crunching heavily as he fought against the wind. The Parker home appeared through the flurry like a ghost, small, dark, weighed down by snow, with the porch light flickering weakly behind a curtain of blowing ice. No footprints, no movement, no warmth, just silence. Ranger reached the front steps and froze, muscles tight, breath puffing out in angry bursts. Mason felt Emily tense in his arms. "That's home," she whispered. Mason scanned the windows. They were pitch black, not even the faint glow of a lamp. The house looked abandoned, but he knew better. Evil didn't need light to operate. "Ranger," he said quietly. "Check." The shepherd trotted along the porch, sniffing hard. Then he stiffened and let out a deep rolling growl that vibrated in the air. Blood. Mason didn't need Ranger to tell him. He could feel it, an almost physical shift in the atmosphere, the kind that always came right before or after violence. Emily pointed with a trembling hand. "Back door. Mommy leaves it open sometimes." Mason carried her through the snow-packed path along the house. The drifts came up to his knees, but he pushed through until they reached the back porch. The handle was frozen solid. He set Emily behind him carefully. "Stay right here. Don't move until I tell you." Then he rammed his shoulder against the door. On the first hit, the frame cracked. On the second, the lock gave way. On the third, the door burst inward, and snow exploded into the darkened kitchen like the storm itself was chasing them inside. Ranger shot through the opening with a snarl. Mason stepped in after him, immediately hit by the smell of iron and fear. The kitchen was a wreck. Chairs overturned, drawers dumped out, shards of glass littering the tiles. A lamp lay broken, its cord still sparking faintly on the floor. "Stay behind me," he ordered Emily, keeping her tucked close to his side as they crossed into the living room. That was when he saw her. Sarah Parker lay crumpled near the coffee table, her limbs twisted unnaturally, half her face obscured by messy waves of chestnut-brown hair. Even in the dim blue wash of moonlight, Mason could see the bruising, dark purples and sickening greens spreading across her cheek and collarbone. Her skin looked far too pale against the carpet, and her lips trembled with faint, shallow breaths. She was a woman in her early 30s, naturally slender, with soft features that might once have belonged to someone gentle, someone who smiled easily. But the pain and terror etched into her now painted a far different picture, one of a mother who had endured far more than anyone should. Emily tried to run to her, but Mason caught her instantly. "Wait," he whispered. "Let me check." Ranger snarled suddenly, turning his head toward the hallway. His body dropped into a defensive stance. Mason's blood ran cold. He stepped toward Sarah carefully, keeping Emily behind him. "Sarah," he said quietly, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered and she winced. When her eyes finally opened, they were unfocused, but filled with dread. He's still here," she croaked. Emily whimpered and hid behind Mason's leg. Another noise echoed from down the hall, something falling, something heavy. Ranger barked viciously. Then a door slammed open. Derek Vaughn stepped into the living room. He was tall, taller than Mason by at least an inch, with a thick, heavy build softened only by the slouch of a man who lived more with his fists than his spine. His blonde hair hung in greasy strands that brushed the collar of his denim jacket. His beard was patchy and uneven, like he'd given up caring about anything but the next fight. His eyes were the worst, pale blue, watery, but burning with wild, unstable anger. He held a knife in his right hand. The blade was stained. "Well, look at this," he sneered. "The kid brought home a hero." Emily clung to Mason, shaking. Derek raised the knife. He didn't get the chance to swing it. Ranger exploded toward him like a missile. The dog's jaws clamped down on Derek's forearm, wrenching a scream from his throat. Derek slammed into the wall with a crash, knocking down picture frames that shattered around them. Mason seized the opening. He lunged and grabbed Derek's wrist, slamming it against the wall until the knife dropped and skidded under the couch. Derek punched wildly, fueled by rage and desperation. Mason deflected the blow and drove his knee into Derek's stomach. The man doubled over, cursing, spit flying. "You don't know who you're messing with," Derek snarled. Mason locked his arm around Derek's throat and forced him to the floor, Ranger holding tight to the man's arm until Mason commanded sharply, "Leave." Ranger released instantly but stayed poised, teeth bared. Derek writhed, but Mason overpowered him easily, wrestling his arms behind his back. With one swift motion, he tore the cord from a toppled lamp and tied Derek's wrists together, pulling the knots tight enough to cut off circulation. Only when Derek lay fully restrained, panting, defeated, glaring up at him, did Mason finally turn back to Sarah. Emily rushed to her mother, sobbing, "Mommy!" Sarah lifted a trembling hand to touch her daughter's face. "Emily, you're okay." Mason knelt beside them. "Sarah, I need to know, what was he looking for?" She swallowed hard, fighting for breath. "USB, in Emily's stuffed rabbit. He can't find it." "Why?" Mason asked gently. Her eyes filled with terror so deep Mason felt it like a punch. "Because what's on it isn't just about him, it's about all of them." She gasped. "If they know he failed, they'll come back. They'll kill us." Outside, the blizzard howled louder, rattling the shattered door, and for the first time since entering the house, Mason felt something worse than fear. He felt certainty. This night wasn't over, not even close. The ambulance's wailing siren cut through the storm like a desperate knife, forcing its way across the frozen streets of Redwood Falls. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, coating the windshield in layers so heavy that the wipers struggled to keep up. The vehicle crawled forward, inch by inch, its tires fighting against ice. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline. Sarah Parker lay strapped to the stretcher, oxygen mask over her bruised face, her chest rising in shallow, fragile breaths. Under the piercing fluorescent lights, she looked even more delicate than before. Her complexion washed out pale, her long chestnut hair tangled and stiffened by dried blood, the slender bones of her wrists clearly visible above the straps holding her down. Though battered, she still carried an unmistakable softness, gentle eyes, fine cheekbones, the kind of woman whose kindness had likely been mistaken for weakness far too often. Emily sat beside her mother, clutching Mason's gloved hand. Her little body trembled not only from the cold, but from the realization that everything familiar was slipping away. She had barely spoken since the house. Her shock clung to her like frost. Mason sat on the opposite bench, broad frame hunched forward, elbows on his knees. Ranger lay at his feet, alert, ears perked, breath-forming fog in the cold interior. The dog's amber fur was still ruffled from the fight, his muscles taut even while lying down. Ranger's gaze flicked to every corner of the ambulance, guarding the two vulnerable passengers. Mason watched Sarah, noticing how her eyelids fluttered in pain with each bump the vehicle hit. He had seen this look before, victims halfway between consciousness and collapse, clinging to life through sheer will. He felt that familiar ache settle in his chest, an old, heavy guilt from his last failed mission overseas. The kind of guilt that made him promise himself, even silently, that tonight he would not lose anyone. Not again. The ambulance slowed to a near crawl as it reached the emergency entrance of Redwood Falls General Hospital, its headlights reflecting off the towering icicles clinging to the roof. Two paramedics, both bundled in heavy winter coats, threw open the back doors. One was a tall woman named Jenna, her short auburn hair tucked under a wool cap, freckles spread across her cheeks. She had the steady, controlled movements of someone who had seen too much pain to let it faze her. The other was a stout, middle-aged man named Lewis, with thick eyebrows and a gruff beard flecked with gray. He was the kind of man who pretended he didn't care, but the way he adjusted Sarah's oxygen mask with gentle precision hinted at a softer heart beneath that frozen exterior. "Let's get her inside," Jenna called out. "Storm's getting worse." Emily held tight to Mason's coat as they all rushed through the sliding doors. Ranger pressed close to his leg. The warmth of the lobby hit, like a wave, but it did nothing to ease the dread clenching Mason's stomach. They hurried down a narrow hallway painted in fading beige. Doctors and nurses moved quickly between rooms, the storm outside creating a surge of emergency cases, slip and falls, frostbite, a car accident from an overturned truck. The hospital buzzed with barely controlled chaos. Sarah was wheeled into a treatment room. Emily reached for her mother, but a nurse gently guided the girl back. "You'll see her in a bit, sweetheart. Let the doctors help her first." Emily nodded numbly, then buried her face against Mason's coat. Mason placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady. "She's in good hands now." A door swung shut. Sarah disappeared behind it. Mason led Emily to a small waiting area. Ranger immediately sat in front of them, guarding them like an immovable statue. Mason felt the tension coiling in the dog. Ranger somehow sensed the danger lingering in the air. After several minutes, the door opened again. A doctor stepped out, a slim man in his mid-50s named Dr. Alan Whitford. He had salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, rectangular glasses perched on a straight nose, and a calm, soothing expression that only years of experience could carve. His voice was reassuring, but not falsely so. "She's stable for now," he said, lowering his voice for Emily's sake. "Severe bruising, a head injury, but she'll recover. She needs rest." Emily let out a breath that sounded like a sob swallowed halfway. Mason stood. "Can I talk to her?" Dr. Whitford hesitated, then nodded. "For a moment. She asked for you." Mason stepped into the dimly lit recovery room. Sarah lay on the hospital bed, IV lines connected to her arm, her hair fanned around her head like a dark halo. The snowstorm outside pulsed against the window like a warning heartbeat. She turned her head toward him, wincing. "Emily, is she safe?" "Yes," Mason said firmly. "She's right outside." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "Thank you." "You're not safe yet," Mason said gently. "You mentioned a USB. I need you to tell me everything." Sarah swallowed, her throat muscles trembling. "It has emails, recordings, names. Derek wasn't working alone. He was part of something bigger. I found the drive when he left his laptop open one day. I think he was collecting money for them. Extortion, fake documents, threats." "Who are they?" Mason asked. Her voice dropped to a shaky whisper. "People who make Derek look harmless." Mason felt the weight of her words settle like ice in his chest. "I hid the USB inside Emily's stuffed rabbit," she continued. "The pink one with the floppy ears. If they find it, they'll kill us." Mason nodded slowly. "We'll protect you both." Before Sarah could respond, Ranger suddenly snapped his head toward the window. His body stiffened. A growl vibrated through. His chest, deep, low, dangerous. Mason's pulse spiked. "What is it, boy?" Ranger paced toward the hallway door, nose lifted, breathing rapid. Mason recognized the behavior immediately. Ranger had detected someone close. He stepped outside the room, leaving Sarah to rest. Emily looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Mason crouched down to her level. "Emily," he whispered, "did anyone follow you earlier? Anyone besides Derek?" Emily shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I was running." Suddenly, Ranger barked, loud enough to echo through the floor. Mason turned sharply. 3 figures appeared at the far end of the hallway. They wore black winter coats soaked with snow, hoods raised, faces partially hidden behind scarves. Their shoulders hunched forward in a way Mason recognized instantly. Predators pretending to be casual. The tallest man, a burly figure with broad shoulders, shifted his weight, revealing the outline of something metallic beneath his coat. His eyes were dark, narrow, and cold, scanning the hospital corridor like he was checking off targets. The second man was leaner, with slick black hair and sharp cheekbones. His movements were twitchy, the kind that came from nervous excitement or dangerous impatience. His gaze darted between doors, hungry, searching. The third was the youngest, barely 30, with icy blonde hair and a scar slicing diagonally across his jaw. His expression was blank in a way that unsettled Mason more than rage ever could. These were not random men seeking warmth. These were hunters. Emily's breath hitched. "Mr. Mason." "That's them." Mason's muscles tensed. "Stay behind me." The tallest intruder spotted Ranger and froze. Mason saw the exact moment he realized the dog was trained, lethal, and not alone. The man reached into his coat. Ranger lunged forward. "Ranger, hold," Mason hissed. The dog halted inches ahead, growling. The 3 men hesitated, perhaps unsure whether a full confrontation in a hospital hallway was wise. But the blizzard outside meant fewer witnesses, fewer security guards, fewer barriers. Mason stepped forward, shoulders squared. His voice was low, cold, commanding. "You're in the wrong place." The scar-jawed man smirked. "We're exactly where we need to be." The hallway lights flickered from the wind, and in that brief darkness, Mason saw their hands moving. He braced himself. The storm outside howled against the windows, rattling the glass. Tonight, the danger had followed them. Tonight, the real fight was about to begin. The snowstorm intensified as midnight approached, turning Redwood Falls into a white void where even streetlights looked like faint ghosts swallowed by the swirling ice. The world outside the hospital seemed to vanish into a single sheet of storm. But inside the bustling command room hastily set up near the ER wing, tension hung heavy and sharp. Mason Cole stood over a table littered with maps, crime scene photos, and the USB. Sarah had nearly died protecting. His jaw was locked tight as he listened to Captain Reyes, the lead local detective, brief the gathered officers. Reyes was a thick-set man in his early 40s, with copper-toned skin and a square jaw peppered with stubble. His short black hair was streaked with early gray, and a thin scar cut across his left eyebrow, a mark he'd earned during a meth lab raid years ago. He was respected in Redwood Falls, competent, tough, and relentlessly dedicated. Tonight, though, even he looked rattled. "This USB," Reyes began, tapping the device with a gloved finger, "contains enough evidence to implicate multiple members of an organized extortion ring operating out of northern Colorado. Derek Vaughn was small-time, but the people he worked for? They're not." His voice sharpened as he looked at Mason. "And they just sent 3 armed men into a hospital storm to silence a witness. That tells us how badly they want this gone." Mason nodded once. Ranger, sitting at his side, gave a soft growl as if echoing the sentiment. Reyes continued, "We traced a pattern of their drop points and cross-referenced it with Sarah's metadata. It all leads to one place." He pointed at the map, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Redwood Falls, sitting alone like a forgotten skeleton near the edge of the frozen river. Mason exhaled slowly. "They'll be clearing the evidence." "Exactly," Reyes said. "And with the storm, they think no one will come for them." Mason straightened. "Then they're wrong." The SWAT team assembled quickly, though the storm made everything twice as slow. Ranger paced anxiously between boots and tactical gear, sensing the rising tension. Emily sat in a blanket nearby, watched over by a nurse, her wide eyes following Mason the entire time. When he approached to check on her, she tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Mason, will you come back?" she whispered. He lowered to one knee. "I will." "And will you bring Ranger back too?" Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, offering comfort the way only a dog could. Emily smiled weakly, then clutched the stuffed rabbit tightly, her mother's hiding place for the UAB. Mason rose, the weight of responsibility settling over him like another layer of ice. But this time, the burden didn't crush him. It steadied him. They were ready. The convoy arrived at the warehouse slowly, headlights fighting through the storm. Wind slammed against the vehicles, rattling metal and shaking windows. The world outside was a swirling white abyss. Mason could barely distinguish the warehouse until they were only yards away. It loomed in the darkness, a massive corrugated steel structure with a collapsed loading dock and shattered windows. Snow had piled up along its walls, and the roof sagged under the weight. The building looked abandoned, but Ranger's reaction said otherwise. As soon as Mason opened the vehicle door, Ranger bolted forward, nose to the wind, barking sharply. The SWAT leader, a tall woman named Lieutenant Naomi Briggs, gestured to her team. Briggs was in her mid-30s, athletic, with close-cropped curls beneath her helmet and a stern, commanding presence. She carried herself like someone who had climbed ranks through grit, not favors. "Positions!" she shouted over the wind. Her unit moved with precision, forming a semicircle. Mason and Ranger joined at the front where visibility was the worst but tracking the strongest. Ranger sniffed along the snow, tail stiff, ears forward. Then he pulled hard toward a side entrance. "They're inside," Mason said. Briggs nodded and signaled 2 officers to breach. The explosion of the door echoed like thunder. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows and stale cold air. Their flashlights cut thin beams through dust and drifting snow. Metal racks loomed like steel skeletons. Boxes lay torn open on the floor. And then, gunfire, sharp, ricocheting, ear-splitting. "Cover!" Briggs shouted as bullets sparked against concrete pillars. The SWAT team returned fire, their shouts mixing with the howl of wind spilling through cracked windows. Mason kept low, Ranger beside him, the dog's growls syncing with the beat of Mason's heart. He scanned the shadows until he spotted movement on the mezzanine, 2 armed men firing down from behind rusted railings. Ranger barked sharply. "I see them," Mason whispered. He moved along a row of crates, staying silent, while SWAT pinned the attackers with suppressing fire. Ranger led him around a forklift and toward a staircase. They climbed quietly. Snow drifted in through a shattered skylight, turning the upper walkway into a slick death trap. But Mason's movements were controlled and precise, guided by instinct and training. At the top, the gunman reloaded behind a stack of crates. Mason lunged, 1 punch, 2. The man went down hard, and Ranger pinned him with a snarl until Mason could disarm him. A second gunman charged from the other side, swinging a crowbar instead of firing. Mason barely ducked in time. The blow cracked the railing, sending rusted flakes scattering. The attacker was large, broad chest, heavy set, with thick arms inked in faded tattoos. His beard was coarse and unkempt, eyes wild with adrenaline. Mason could tell this man wasn't motivated by fear of jail. He was motivated by fear of his boss. "Where's the evidence?" Mason demanded between blows. The man spat blood and swung. Again. "Burning. Everything." Mason struck hard, knocking him unconscious. Below them, chaos erupted. A burst of orange light flashed from behind a series of storage crates. Then, boom! An explosion roared through the warehouse, sending heat and dust ripping through the building. A stack of files ignited instantly, flames licking up piles of evidence. The blast knocked half the steel shelving sideways and cracked ceiling beams. Briggs shouted orders. "Everyone out! The structure's compromised!" But Mason didn't move. Something in Ranger's posture told him there was more. The dog sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, barking wildly. Mason chased after him, weaving through burning debris until they reached a partially collapsed section. And there, behind a stack of scorched pallets, was a bound man in his late 50s, tied and gagged. He had thinning gray hair, a weathered face, and a frightened expression. His clothes were torn, hands tied behind his back so tight the skin had turned purple. Mason cut him free. "Who are you?" The accountant," the man stammered. "They forced me to keep their records. I tried to quit. They were going to kill me." Mason helped him up, Ranger circling protectively. "Move," Mason ordered. "The roof's going." He guided the man toward the exit just as another explosion rocked the far wall. Flames shot upward, and part of the ceiling collapsed in a shower of sparks. Outside, Briggs waved them through snow and smoke. Officers covered their retreat. Within minutes, the warehouse surrendered to fire. The roof caved, sending a plume of orange and white into the storm. Snowflakes glowed red as they drifted past the flames, melting before they touched the ground. The criminals who hadn't escaped the gunfight were handcuffed in the snow. Among them, Derek Vaughn. He'd tried to flee during the chaos but collapsed in a snowbank, shivering, his arrogance replaced by desperation. When he saw Mason, his lips curled in a broken snarl. "You don't know what you've done?" Mason stared at him coldly. "I know exactly what I've stopped." Derek spat into the snow as officers hauled him up. Behind them, the warehouse groaned, then collapsed inward, burying the remains of the criminal operations beneath burning steel and drifting ice. Ranger sat beside Mason, snow clinging to his fur, chest heaving with exhaustion. Mason placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall. "It's over," Mason whispered. But as the flames roared against the storm, a thought crept into his mind. If this gang was big enough to send armed men into a hospital during a blizzard, this victory might not end everything. Snow lingered across Redwood Falls like a soft memory, the last remnants of the storm resting gently on rooftops and tree branches. The sky had cleared into a pale winter blue, and the world seemed to breathe again after weeks of ice and chaos. For the first time in a long while, the town felt quiet. Not the dangerous, suffocating quiet Mason had known on battlefields, but a stillness that felt earned. Mason Cole stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching lightly on the thin layer of snow covering the walkway leading to the Parker home. He carried no weapon, no tactical gear, no surge of adrenaline tonight, just a wrapped box tucked under his arm in the presence of Ranger walking faithfully by his side. The German Shepherd seemed lighter than usual, tail sweeping through the snow in relaxed arcs, amber fur shimmering beneath the porch lights. It was Christmas Eve. Lights twinkled along the eaves of the house, casting warm reflections in the windows. A small wreath hung crookedly on the front door, clearly arranged by little hands. The wooden steps had been swept recently, though patches of snow still clung to the corners. The house was small, modest, its paint a little weathered, but tonight it carried a glow so welcoming that even Mason felt his chest loosen as he approached. Ranger gave a soft bark and nudged Mason's leg, as if urging him forward. Mason exhaled a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I know, I'm going." He didn't usually do holidays. Growing up with a father who was constantly on the road and a mother too exhausted to decorate or celebrate meant most Christmases had blended into ordinary, forgettable days. And after years in the Marines, deployments, missions, missed calls, holidays had become nothing but markers on a calendar, days that belonged to other people. But tonight felt different. He hadn't even reached the door before it burst open. "Mr. Mason!" Emily Parker shot out like a bullet of pure joy, bundled in a puffy pink coat and fuzzy white boots, her brown curls bouncing wildly behind her. Her cheeks were rosy from the cold, her eyes bright with excitement. She barreled into Mason, nearly knocking the box out of his hands, and wrapped her arms around his middle with a force that stunned him. Mason laughed, a real, warm laugh he hadn't felt in years. He peeled one glove off and ruffled her hair. "Careful, you'll knock us both into the snow." She pulled back only enough to look up at him, her voice full of breathless hope. "You came. You really came." "I said I would," Mason replied softly. Ranger trotted forward and immediately received his own greeting. Emily dropped to her knees, hugging the dog around the neck. Ranger accepted the affection proudly, tail wagging hard enough to thump against Mason's leg. "You're both here," Emily said, pressing her cheek against Ranger's fur. "Does that mean you're staying for the whole night?" Mason opened his mouth, but the voice that answered belonged to someone else. "He's staying as long as he wants." Sarah Parker appeared in the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. She wore a cream-colored sweater and soft gray leggings, her long chestnut hair brushed neatly and falling past her shoulders. Her bruises were fading now, yellowed at the edges, nearly gone, though faint traces still clung to her cheekbones and collar. Even so, she looked healthier, stronger. Her pale complexion had regained its warmth, and her eyes, once clouded with fear, now reflected something gentler, gratitude, hope, and a depth of emotion she had learned the hard way to protect. As she stepped into the glow of the porch light, Mason noticed how she carried herself, carefully, but with intention. Sarah had always looked soft, but now there was a steadiness beneath that softness, a resilience born not from avoiding pain, but from surviving it. "Hi," she murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that melted the air between them. Mason nodded, his throat tightening unexpectedly. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I ever thought I would." Sarah smiled, a small smile, but a real one. "The doctor said I'm healing quickly, no lasting injuries." She paused. "Thanks to you." Mason shook his head. "You're the one who survived all that. You protected your daughter. That wasn't me." Sarah took a slow step closer, her eyes meeting his with quiet certainty. "No. You saved us. Don't take that away." Before Mason could respond, Emily tugged at his sleeve again. "Come on! Mommy made hot chocolate and the fire is really warm." Sarah laughed softly. "She's been waiting at the window since sunset." "Well," Mason said, clearing his throat, "I can't disappoint my lookout." He stepped inside. Warmth greeted him instantly, both from the crackling fireplace and from the sense of peace filling the room. The house was simple but cozy. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with mismatched ornaments that clearly had stories behind them. A handmade paper star sat crookedly on top. Ranger lay down on the rug near the fire, stretching out with a satisfied groan, as if claiming the spot as his rightful kingdom. Emily plopped onto the floor beside him, stroking his fur. "See, Ranger?" she whispered conspiratorially. "I told you he'd come back." Mason set the gift box beneath the tree, then turned when he felt Sarah watching him. She stood near the couch, hands folded in front of her, illuminated by the soft amber glow of the room. "These last few weeks," she began, her voice gentle but steady, "I've been scared. not just of what happened, but of what life would look like after. I didn't know if Emily and I would feel safe again. Mason listened quietly, and then you showed up. Not just that night at the house, not just at the hospital, but for everything afterward. She stepped closer. You didn't just save our lives, Mason. You gave us something I thought we'd lost forever. What's that? He asked softly. Hope, she whispered. Mason swallowed. He felt the words land somewhere deep inside, knocking loose something he'd kept buried under guilt and memories of men he couldn't save. But standing here, looking at Emily laughing with Ranger, at Sarah smiling through the warmth of the fire, he realized this wasn't a battlefield. This was a home. Sarah laid a hand lightly on his arm. Will you stay? He looked at her, then at Emily, curled happily against Ranger's side. I'm not going anywhere, he said, voice low, sure, and warm. Emily jumped up, wrapping him in another hug. The fire crackled louder, casting moving shadows along the walls like gentle dancers. Outside, the wind blew softly, its bite no longer harsh. Inside, the room was filled with something deeper than warmth, something that wrapped around the three of them like a blanket. Peace. The kind that wasn't fragile, the kind that came after surviving the storm. Sarah moved to close the curtains. Snowflakes drifted past the window, catching the light from the lamppost in soft, glowing swirls. She paused for a moment, turning back toward Mason. Merry Christmas, she said. He smiled. Merry Christmas. Ranger lifted his head, gave a soft huff of approval, then settled again as Emily giggled and buried her hands in his fur. The world outside remained cold, quiet, and white. But inside this little home in Redwood Falls, warmth had returned, slowly, carefully, but undeniably. The fighting was over, the danger was gone, and for the first time in a long while, Mason felt something rise in his chest that he had almost forgotten how to feel. Belonging. The winter no longer felt endless because he wasn't facing it alone. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or angels or signs in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through the courage of a child, the kindness of a stranger, or the strength God places in our hearts when we feel at our weakest. This story reminds us that even in the darkest storms of life, there is always a light waiting to be found, and often that light comes through people God sends our way at exactly the right moment. As you go through your own days, full of challenges, worries, and hopes, may you remember that grace often appears in ordinary places. A warm home, a helping hand, a loyal friend, a moment of peace after hardship. May this story remind you that no one is truly alone and that healing, love, and new beginnings are always possible. If this message touched you, please share the video with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to let us know your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of faith, resilience, and hope. May God bless you and your family, protect you on your journey, and fill your home with peace and light.